distinguished historian from the University of Maryland at Park, Professor Jeffrey Herf. I have had the pleasure of hearing Professor Herf give a few seminars. You probably don't know, but he gave one of his most famous ones was at NYU, shortly after Tony Judt wrote a piece in the New York Times about the Israel lobby. And Dr. Herf received his bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin, he got a master's from SUNY Buffalo and his PhD for sociology from my own alma mater, Brandeis University. His most recent publications include Divided Memory, the Nazi Past in Two Germanys, Harvard University Press, 1997, which was the American Historical Association's George Louis Beer Prize. He's got The Jewish Enemy, Nazi Propaganda During World War II and the Holocaust, Harvard University Press 2006, which was the winner of the National Book Award for the work on the Holocaust, and Nazi Propaganda and the Arab World. That's one of the papers I've heard him give, which was awarded the German Studies Association Sibyl Milton Prize for work on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, and was won the Bronze Prize for the Washington Institute for Near East Politics. How am I doing so far in here?
I think that's enough.
In addition to that, he is just even better than that. Is it enough? Okay, so today, Dr. Professor Herf gives a talk that draws on the research that he's currently doing on the era of secular anti-Zionism, secular anti-Zionism in East Germany. I suppose those are archives that are right now becoming much more available. Please join me in welcoming Professor Herf.
Thank you. I'm here because I couldn't say no to Charles Small, and Charles is caught in traffic at the moment and should join us shortly. I miss Tony Judd very much. I remember the seminar that you mentioned, and Tony was a very fine historian, and we agreed about 80% of the time. And if you agree with somebody about 80% of the time, that's more than enough to have a relationship of mutual friendship and respect. And even if you profoundly disagree 20% of the time, and that was sort of the nature of our relationship. It's very sad that he's not here. With this audience and this institute, I want to, toward the end of the talk, raise this question of the relationship between secular anti-Zionism and the Islamist anti-Semitism that has been prominent in the last decade and a half or so, and that has preoccupied Charles and led to the formation of...
Sorry, could you speak up a little?
Yeah. That has preoccupied Charles Small and led to the formation of this... oh, there's a mic. That's better. Of this institute. This work in progress is a sequel to a book that I wrote in 1997, Divided Memory, and one half of Divided Memory is about the suppression and repression of the Jewish question in East Germany, and I examined the East German chapter of a Soviet bloc-wide phenomenon called the anti-cosmopolitan purges. And what the purges meant after 1953 was that to be a communist, or to be a member of a communist party, was to be an anti-Zionist. One could not be a supporter of the State of Israel or an advocate of Zionism and remain within the communist movement or communist parties. This was not the case. Now, and in West Germany, the German Communist Party was banned in the early 50s, so the Communist Party was not a factor in West German politics, and and the generation that came of age after the war in West Germany was generally liberals and left-leaning young people were pro-Israeli and traveled to Israel and worked on kibbutzim and the like. And as you know, the West German left became famous in West Germany, in Europe, and really around the world for for the activities of several hundred people who were engaged in 2 decades of very, very violent terrorism, such as the Red Army faction, the Revolutionary Cells, the Baader-Meinhof gang. And these groups generated a great deal of attention in the media. There's a good film called The Baader-Meinhof Complex. Maybe some of you have seen it. And a lot of the attention that has been devoted to the question of post-war Germany and the Middle East has been devoted to the questions of West German terrorism. Now, I've been doing research in the files of the East and the West German governments at the time, and the files of the West German Interior Ministry, comparable to our Justice Ministry, contain fascinating records of government cases, and the files of the West German Supreme Court as well, the counterpart to the Attorney General, very detailed records about what the various terrorist organizations were doing. When the West German police, the special police units that were devoted to dealing with the terrorist groups, raided a safe house in West Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Heidelberg, they would find maybe 5 pistols, 2 machine guns, some material for explosives, the kind of material needed to engage in bank robberies, political assassinations, and bombing of an airline office, perhaps, or serious stuff. Over the period of 1970 and 1992, the Red Army faction murdered about 34 people, which is a pittance compared to what terrorists have done in recent years, but it was a lot. Now, interestingly enough, East Germany did not engage in terrorism in West Germany, but East Germany was far more consequential than the West German terrorists for events in the Middle East, and for a very simple reason. The West German terrorists were the extreme wing of a left-wing social movement. The East German government was a government. It had embassies in the Middle East, it had intelligence organizations, it had a military, the whole scale of what it could offer to the Middle East was of a whole different dimension. And it was a member of the Warsaw Pact, allied to a military superpower, the Soviet Union. So in fact, while East Germany has aroused far less interest in recent decades in the media, it was far more important than the Red Army faction and the Revolutionary Cells and June 2nd movement for what was actually going on in the conflict in the Middle East. So that's why tonight I want to turn our gaze to the German Democratic Republic, or the GDR. In the book that I'm working on, I will have a lot to say about the Red Army faction and the Revolutionary Cells in the West German scene. But tonight I want to talk about the East Germans. And the conclusion that I've arrived at is that the East German government was in something approaching a state of war with the State of Israel. And that if its policies and the policies of its Warsaw Pact allies in the Soviet Union had succeeded, the State of Israel would have been destroyed in the 1970s or 1980s. And the reason that the State of Israel was not destroyed was, of course, primarily what the Israelis had done, but also the United States. And I think that one of the things that historians do, is to remind us of how things looked in the past before looking back at them through the prism of 1989. In 1973, which I'll get to in a bit, during the Yom Kippur War, things looked very dire for Israel. And And it was as a result of the American resupply operation that the Israelis were able to recover from their initial losses. But there were other resupply operations going on the Soviet side, including those of East Germany. Now I want to talk about those later. Now, the reason that East Germany was so antagonistic to Israel had several sources. First, the East Germans were communists. That is, they were Marxist-Leninists. And we don't think about that enough, or think it through. And as Marxist-Leninists, they believe that the global economy was dominated by the United States global imperialism, and that the United States and the Western European and Japanese capitalists were responsible for the impoverishment and suffering of most of the world. And that the State of Israel had become what they called a spearhead of American imperialism in the Middle East. So this was a genuine conviction based on communist ideology. Now then there were other motivations. The Soviet motivation was to win the Cold War against the United States. And how could that be done? Well, in many ways, of course, but one way would be to grab the oil jugular of the West European economies and support the Arabs in that way, and try to strike a blow against a vulnerable Western Europe in that way. And Israel stood in the way along those lines. And third, the East German government was responding to a diplomatic offensive that had been launched by the West German government. This offensive began in 1955, and it was named after a man named Walter Hallstein. And Walter Hallstein was a diplomat, a deputy secretary of state in the Adenauer government. And the Hallstein Doctrine declared that the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, would not recognize any government that recognized the German Democratic Republic. And the purpose of the Hallstein Doctrine was to isolate East Germany, to undermine its legitimacy, and hopefully to bring about the collapse of the regime. So one of the primary goals of East German diplomacy and the East German foreign ministry in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, was to break the Hallstein Doctrine and to gain diplomatic recognition outside. Of course, East Germany was recognized by Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Poland, but to gain diplomatic recognition outside the Warsaw Pact. Now, the way that the East Germans were hoping to break the Hallstein Doctrine was to do it first with the Arab states. By convincing them and presenting evidence that East Germany was a firm antagonist of the State of Israel, just as they were, and therefore East Germany was in a common struggle with them. 1967 is of enormous importance in this story. Many of you are familiar with the shooting of Benno in West Berlin in 1967. Benno was a young student, was a 20-year-old student at the Free University who was protesting the visit of the Shah of Iran, and a West Berlin policeman, Karl-Heinz Kurras, shot him at close range and killed him. And the Onusorg shooting was, this was 67, this was 3 years before Kent State and it was early. The Onusorg shooting convinced the young left that the West Berlin police force and the West German government was tainted with authoritarianism and neo-fascism, and that democracy and civil liberties were at risk. It was not revealed until 2 or 3 years ago that Karl-Heinz Kurras was an agent of the East German intelligence service at the time. A political complex emerged in the June days of '67, because the enthusiasm for Israel in West Berlin was most pronounced in the newspapers published by a man named Axel Springer, who was a conservative. And so there was this complex that was established that lasted for decades. The Springer Press and the conservatives support Israel. The conservatives are attacking the New Left. The police shot Ben-Atar, and therefore we are opposed to the conservatives, so we're going to oppose Israel. Some of the figures who were most prominent in the turn of the West German New Left to its antagonism to Israel, such as Karl Dietrich Wolff, the president of SDS, Ulrich Meinhof, or Wilfried Böse, more about Böse later, date their radicalization to the June days of '67, more so than the famous spring of 1968. So, June of '67 for the West German left is a turning point. It is a break point. And it was kind of a breaking point for the American New Left too. Less has been written about it, but those of you who know something about Marty Peretz's political biography will recognize the importance of 1967 as well in American intellectual and political life. In East Germany, June of '67 was not a turning point. It was not a turning point. It was a manifestation of long-held beliefs that had been percolating and developing since the anti-cosmopolitan purges of '53. Now, to the outside world, and the world that wasn't paying close attention to developments within East Germany, it came as a stunning revelation and a shock when, on June 15th, Walter Ulbricht, the General Secretary of the Socialist Unity Party and the leader of the East German government, gave a speech in Leipzig. Before he gave that speech, the Politburo had met, and the Ministerial Council had denounced Israel's aggression. In the pages of this newspaper, Neues Deutschland, New Germany, the official paper of the East German government, Israel had attacked Egypt and Syria in order to crush the attempts of Egypt and Syria to take a non-capitalist path, and that it was part of the global strategy of U.S. imperialism to expand its influence in the Middle East. You will find nothing in Neues Deutschland in these decades that Israel had faced any threat whatsoever. And so the history of Israel, as it is presented in the communist press, is a history of continuous oppression, exclusion, of denial of rights to the Palestinians. There is no redeeming feature whatsoever to the state of Israel. It is just a continuous story of really political evil and injustice. At no point is Israel faced with any legitimate threats. This is those of you who have read communist newspapers, the communist government newspapers of this period will recognize lots of gray type. This was typical. This was the background to Israeli aggression. This was written by the Foreign Ministry on page 2 of Neues Deutschland that month. This is a declaration of the Central Committee of the Communist Parties and governments of Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Yugoslavia, Poland, the Soviet Union, and Hungary, again denouncing the Israeli aggression and expressing solidarity with the Arab states. And this is a text in Neues Deutschland from Walter Ulbricht's speech on June 15th of 1967. And this is a photo of, it's not a good quality photo, but that's Ulbricht coming to the speech. This is Ulbricht and his wife arriving in Leipzig on June 15th. Now, what did he say? And here's where this group this is one more point at which I hope this evening's discussion will be fruitful. The Islamists claim that Israel is an enormously powerful force in world history and is part of a global conspiracy, a leading factor in a global conspiracy. The communists did not use the conspiracy theories of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Rather, the focus, the center of communist argument was Leninist. And Israel was not the key opponent. The key opponent was the United States, and what Ulbricht called its global strategy. The cause of the Six-Day War, he said, did not lie in Arab threats to destroy Israel, the movement of Arab armies closer to Israel's borders, but in the desire of the imperialist colonial rulers to prevent the Arab countries from attaining economic independence, to exploit the region. And Israel, he said, had brought shame and disgrace on itself by playing the role of an imperialist aggressor against the Arab states. Moreover, he attacked West Germany for its restitution payments to Israel. While this was a source of pride in West Germany, Ulbricht just thought this was an effort to buy respectability, a cynical effort that was again part simply of global imperialism. Ulbricht also said that the Israeli aerial attack on the Egyptian and Syrian air forces could not have taken place had it not been for the United States. And he described the United States as a major weapons supplier of Israel. Now, those of you who are somewhat familiar with the Six-Day War will recall that the Israeli Air Force was composed of French Mirage jets, and that the United States was not a major military supplier of Israel at all before 1967. Nevertheless, the association of Israel with the despised Americans was an important part of the... And moreover, the language was very incendiary. Now, in the interest of world peace, the Middle East aggressor must be held in check. The world, he said, cannot accept that a quarter century after the Second World War, the aggressor Israel and its men behind the scenes, the Hintermänner, created what he called a Sinai Protectorate, or a general government of Jordan for renewed colonial oppression. Now, by using terms such as Sinai Protectorate and the general government of Jordan, he knew exactly what he was saying. And he evoked the language that he knew his listeners would associate with Nazi Germany's policies in Eastern Europe in World War II. This association of the State of Israel with Nazi Germany remained an enduring element of communist Arab, Palestinian, and West German leftist anti-Zionism over these decades. So the ultimate evil of modern politics is Nazism, and so in Ulbricht's speech here, there are hints of associating the Israelis with the Nazis. The Soviets were enraged over the Arab defeat of 1967. They were furious because they were confident that their MiG-21s, their Kalashnikovs, their artillery, their anti-aircraft weapons were vastly superior to anything in the Israeli arsenal. So how could they have pumped the Israeli governments full of the superior weapons which the Vietnamese were using to such a good effect? And the Arabs have lost. Well, there was a deficiency of military training and ideological outlook in the Arab armies, and so after 1967, the Soviet Union was determined to rearm the Arabs and to engage in more significant training. And so one of the interesting things that begins to happen then in the following years is an extensive program of rearmament and training, and many young Arab officers spend 1, 2, 3 years in Budapest, Prague, Moscow, East Berlin, and those ties between the Russians and the Syrians in particular, well, I will say more about Syria later, go back a long way, and lots of friendships and lots of connections go way back to the 60s. So it's no surprise that Putin is so emphatic on protecting Assad today. One of the questions for research is what we'll call the autonomy issue. East Germany was totally dependent on the Soviet Union for its survival. if the Red Army had pulled out of East Germany at any time between 1949 and 1989, that would have been the end of East Germany. So it is a mistake to present the East Germans as a completely autonomous group who have clearly they're coordinating their foreign policy with the Soviet Union. But I have not seen evidence of a lack of enthusiasm among the East Germans regarding the attack on Israel. And in 1969, Ulbricht wrote to Leonid Brezhnev to propose that East German volunteers join what he called a war of attrition against Israel. That is, and send young East Germans to fight against the Israelis. Nothing came of it, probably because Brezhnev understood that Ulbricht's proposal was a propaganda disaster, that if East German soldiers were actually fighting against the Jewish state, this would not be easy to explain to anybody outside of the East German Politburo. Now, then, those of you who know my work know that I'm interested in politics and ideas, and I write a lot about ideas. But in this project, I'm also interested in, as it were, when the rubber hits the road, the consequences of ideas. In particular, weapons. I had to expand my German vocabulary doing this research. I didn't know the German terms for Kalashnikov and rocket-propelled grenade and various kinds of explosives, so I've learned a great deal. At the center of the relationship between East Germany and Syria, the Palestine Liberation Organization, Iraq, Egypt, Libya, at the center of the military relationship was a man named Heinz Hoffmann, who was not famous. He was born in 1910, he died in 1985. He joined the German Communist Party in 1930. He fought in the Spanish Civil War. He survived the Nazi years in the Soviet Union. He studied in the General Staff Academy of the Soviet Union in 1955-57. He became the defense minister, the deputy defense minister of East Germany in 57, the Army Chief of Staff in 58, and he was the defense minister of the German Democratic Republic from 1960 to 1985. And it was the central figure in the military alliance between East Germany, the PLO, and the Arab states. So the files, the Hoffmann files, are in the East German Defense Ministry in Freiburg, and they are fascinating. They are fascinating. We are in the beginnings of. At the end of this project, of course, I'll want to come up with a figure or figures about how much, the size of arms shipments going from the Soviet bloc as a whole and East Germany. So it's very much a work in progress, and I'm dealing now with fragments. There's a German historian named Klaus Storkmann who's written a book called Geheime Solidarität, Militärbeziehungen und Militärhilfe der DDR und die Dritte Welt, Secret Solidarity, Military Relations and Military Assistance of East Germany to the Third World. It's like a 600 pages book, so there's obviously a lot going on. I've not had time to read it this fall, but I will. In 1969, a memo from Hoffmann's office indicates that East Germany was in contact with the Egyptian Air Force and Navy and was repairing MiG-21 jets. It had exported by 1971 29,000 machine pistols and 12 repair kits for MiG-21s to the Egyptians. Now, by spring and summer of 1969, the combination of diplomatic support, propaganda support, economic assistance, and military assistance had led to the biggest breakthrough in the history of East German diplomatic history. That is, breaking the Holstein Doctrine. And the Holstein Doctrine was broken. The first state to break the Holstein Doctrine and establish diplomatic relations with East Germany was Iraq. On April 30th of 1969, it became the first non-communist government to establish diplomatic relations with East Germany. The foreign minister of East Germany was a man named Otto Binzer, and he displayed his hostility to Zionism early in the anti-cosmopolitan purges, and in his joint declaration with Foreign Minister Abdul Karim al-Shikli of May of '69, they stressed their common antagonism, the commonalities of struggle against the forces, this is in the communique, of imperialism, neo-Nazism, colonialism, and Zionism, and stressed the need for closer cooperation with all anti-imperialist forces to check the maneuvers of imperialism and Zionism. In June, East Germany was granted diplomatic relations by Sudan. Hafez al-Assad I established relations between Syria and East Germany on June 5th, and Nasser's Egypt did so, as well as South Yemen, on July 10th of 1969. These are front-page stories in Neues Deutschland in which Nasser thanks Walter Ulbricht for the speech he gave in Leipzig. In October of 1971, Hoffman led an East German military delegation. This is Heinz Hoffman, and this is Admiral, what's Werner's first name? Admiral Werner, oh here it is, Waldemar Werner. That's the leadership of the East German military. And here are the leaders of the Syrian military, meeting in Damascus in October of 1971. And one of the people sitting at the table on the Syrian side became the chief of the Syrian General Staff, was named Mustafa Tlass, T-L-A-S-S. And some of you, the name Tlass may ring a bell for some of you careful New York Times readers, because his grandson, or nephew, or one of his younger relatives, fled Syria about 6 months ago, broke with the Assad regime, and I believe is in Paris at the moment. But Mustafa Tlass is at the center of the relationship between East Germany, the military relationship between East Germany and Syria. During the week that Hoffman and the delegation were there, Tlass informed Hoffman of a very surprising thing, that an East German communist would really not be too pleased to hear. It's tempting to read the German, but I'm assuming the point. So this is my translation. He informed Hoffman of his, quote, unlimited admiration of the fascist blitzkrieg strategy and of the actual accomplishments of the bourgeois German military. That is, Tlass was one of those Arabs who remembered fondly the military successes of the Nazi regime in Europe and of the military accomplishments of the Wehrmacht. So he expressed serious interest in delivery of Warsaw Pact tanks and MiG fighter jets. And then Hoffman gave an interview several interviews to the Syrian press, and here's an example. In reality, both of our peoples are fighting together against the imperialist and Zionist forces. We in the GDR fight on our border against our enemy, the NATO countries. This enemy is the strongest partner of the American imperialists in Europe, namely West Germany. The American imperialists always stand behind West Germany. In the same way, you here fight against Israel. It too is a partner of the USA. Israel is the bridge for the imperialists in the Middle East. So both of the states, Syria and East Germany, had something in common. They were on the border with the enemy and fighting against imperialism. They were in a common struggle. And Hoffman expressed confidence that we would defeat our common enemy because the struggling people will always win in the end. And there's another point that I want to repeat about the 1970s. That because of the remarkable, collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War with the collapse of the communist states, we forget that in the early 70s and mid-70s, there were many, many communists around the world who thought that they might win the Cold War, that they would, the American defeat in Vietnam would be followed by other victories, and Hoffman's letters and memos expressed that sentiment, and so too do the letters of another very prominent figure in the East German era relations, and that, of course, is Yasser Arafat. In 1970, East Germany became the first of the Warsaw Pact states to open an office for the Palestine Liberation Organization, so in East Berlin. Now, at the time, you recall, the charter of the PLO called for a one-state solution that would eliminate the Jewish state, and it was engaged in terrorist attacks on civilians in Israel. I assume there are some students here, and people who might want to do research. The files of the United Nations are a gold mine, and please use them. It's ridiculously easy to do so. Go to a library and look at something called the UN Yearbook. And each UN annual yearbook will have a little chapter on some big event of that year. All in the Middle East always is. There's always something going on there. So you look at read the chapter, and then at the end of the chapter, there'll be these archival citations. So you go to your computer at home, and you type in UN Official Document System, and type in that archival citation. And lo and behold, you will then see the speech that Israeli Ambassador Joseph Tekoa gave describing this or that attack on Kiryat Shimona, or a letter that Chaim Herzog sent to the Secretary General, or the reply by the Jordanians or the Lebanese or the Syrians denouncing Israel. It's all there, and it's very easy to get. The Security Council documents are already all online. The General Assembly files are in, I don't know if Fordham is a UN depository, but certainly I would assume Columbia and NYU are, and certainly New York Public Library, and then you can get all the UN documents. And there's an enormous amount there, and it's so easy to get at. And there's a lot of description by the Israeli delegation to the United Nations, almost day by day in this period, of this and that attack on this and that village, and how many people were wounded, who was captured. And the detail is astonishing. Now, Arafat visited East Berlin. This is a fun photo. This is Hafez al-Assad in 1978, visiting East Berlin. That's the Brandenburg Gate. This is Gerhard Gruneberg, the point man in the Politburo for Middle East Policy. Arafat visited East Berlin frequently in the 1970s and 1980s. After the Munich massacre at the Olympics, carried out by an organization called Black September, Arafat publicly denied PLO involvement. Western intelligence agencies assumed that Black September was one of many organizations he had helped to create that would give him plausible deniability when they engaged in such activities. On September 17th of 1972, that is just 2 weeks after the attack in Munich, Arafat wrote to Walter Ulbricht, he wrote to Erich Honecker, to Ulbricht's successor as head of the state and party, Erich Honecker, about what he called the action in Munich. And it's a long letter in which he denies that the PLO was responsible for the organization Black September, but he did not directly say the PLO had nothing to do with the action. And most of the letter argues to put the action in the context of the general problem and the historical events in all of their political, national, and human dimensions. So that when Honecker and the Politburo read the letter from Arafat, they knew that they were dealing with a man who was offering justifications for the attack in Munich. He arrived first in East Berlin in 1973. He met the Politburo for the first time in 1973, here are some photos. This is Arafat meeting Honecker again in 1978, in 1982. this is Arafat in 1982 speaking at the kind of dinner that one would have, here at the Council on Foreign Relations. A fancy dinner. Everybody's dressed very well, behaving properly. This is Hanukkah. This is Arafat giving an after-dinner talk. This is a time when Yasser Arafat, in many parts of the world, is regarded as a leading terrorist and hardly a respectable figure. But they could go to East Berlin and they could be treated with respect. They could go to East Berlin and be treated as they were members of a government. Somebody that you sit around the table and have dinner with. And this gentleman here is Farouk Kaddoumi. Farouk Kaddoumi was the foreign minister. He was in charge of foreign relations for the Palestine Liberation Organization. And he was the leading figure representing the PLO in the United Nations. And Kaddoumi was also a frequent visitor in East Berlin in these years. And there's another photo. Here you have, this is Grunberg and Arafat, Hanukkah Kaddoumi in 1978. More, very interesting. Those of you who are familiar with Berlin may have stood where the photographer is standing, because the photographer is standing in the middle of something called the Neue Wache, which is the memorial to victims of fascism and militarism, which is understood as a memorial really to the Red Army as well. And as part of the visit to East Berlin, honored guests, heads of state, would visit the memorial and express their condolences and pay respects to the memories of those who had been killed by Nazi Germany. So here is Arafat, that's Grunberg, Kaddoumi. I'm not sure who this gentleman is. That might be myself, but I'm not sure. There's a photo of Kaddoumi doing the same thing, not on the same occasion. There's Grunberg and Arafat. The history of communism is a history of friendships, of personal connections, of people who met each other all over the world over many, many years. It's a huge world, and historians have only begun to scratch the surface of the real history of international communism. When people hear the phrase international communism, they think Rosa Luxemburg, they think Lenin, they think Zimmerwald, they think Kienthal, they think the 1920s and 30s, as if international communism ceased to exist after that. No, international communism, it had a lot to do with airplanes and hotels and conferences and people really, from all over the last thing the East Germans were was isolated. They had friends all over the world, all over the world, all over the Third World. They became famous and popular at the United Nations for their antagonisms to the United States and to the Zionists. The agreements that were signed that are in the archives of the Politburo in Berlin by Arafat and Grunberg on August 2nd of 1973 included East Germany's commitment to, quote, support the Palestine Liberation Organization with deliveries of equipment of a non-civilian nature. In 1975, the agreement was renewed, the agreements also included treatment of wounded fighters in East German hospitals and fellowships, or not fellowships, but money for students from East Germany to come study, from the Middle East to come study in East Germany. I'm going to skip a few things here. I want to turn to intelligence cooperation. Forget this. We'll talk for a bit. the intelligence cooperation. The files of the Ministry of State Security, the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, known by its colloquial term, the Stasi. The files of this institution are now open for research by scholars. And last spring, I was able to spend time working in the Stasi files. The director of the ministry was a man named Erich Mielke. In 1979, he signed an agreement of cooperation with a man named Abu Ayyad, who was the head of the intelligence agency of the Palestine Liberation Organization, to foster cooperation between the two of them. In August of '79, they agreed that a representative of the PLO intelligence services would have an office in East Berlin. And from then until the collapse of the regime in '89, Abu Ayyad, or his second-in-command, Amin al-Hindi, met several times a year with Mielke or with Gerhard Neiber, the director of what was called the Counterterrorism Division of the Stasi. And the Stasi files of the meetings of these gentlemen are extensive and fascinating. On July 15th of 1980, Ayyad met with officials of the Counterterrorism Division to discuss terrorist forces and their activities. That's the title of the conversation. The PLO, Ayyad said, distinguished between what he called right-wing terrorism, left-wing terrorism, and, quote, terrorist forces that are active in the interests of the Palestinian resistance movement, unquote. Now, he rejected right-wing terrorists and left-wing terrorists, but, he said, the PLO supported the other terrorist forces and at times worked together with them. Unterstützte die PLO die anderen terroristischen Kräfte, arbeitete teilweise mit ihnen zusammen. Now, a striking aspect of the discussions of these gentlemen is the complete absence of euphemism. When they're sitting when they're talking to one another, there is no joking about how one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. They don't even use the term revolutionary violence, not to mention counter-violence. They're simply talking about terrorism. They understood very well that terrorism was the intentional use of violence against non-combatants, and that it was part of the political arsenal of the communist parties and of the, quote, national liberation struggle. When they spoke in the United Nations, of course, they didn't speak that way. And there were big battles in the United Nations about, what is terrorism? And the Soviet Third World Bloc was attempting to redefine the term and redefine terrorism in that context as legitimate revolutionary violence. But when they were just being perfectly frank with one another, they spoke the truth. Now, why would they cooperate? Not in order to stage terrorist attacks in West Germany. Why not? East Germany, you will recall, was in a state of détente with West Germany. And the Soviet Union as well, and the Eastern Bloc were receiving large amounts of money from the West Europeans. And East Germany was receiving large amounts of money from West Germany. So the East German government did not want to put détente at risk. And certainly, one way of putting détente at risk would be to stage terrorist attacks in West Germany. To offer evidence that, in fact, Ulrich Meinhof and Andreas Bader and Wilfried Goeze were being trained and funded and supported, and they organized the attacks in East Germany. Now, if that had happened, the West German government would have said, forget about it. No more money, forget Ostpolitik, forget all this nicey-nicey about German-German relations. You're trying to kill us. Forget it. So it was very important that the East German government know where Carlos is. Where is Bader? Where is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine? Where is Wadi Haddad? Where is George Habash? Who is this kid who just flew from Beirut and landed at Berlin Schönefeld Airport? What the hell is he doing here? We need to know. Because this guy is not going to go to West Germany and blow something up. He is not going to do that. You understand? And so we need your assistance.
We want to know where everybody is. And they did. That was the purpose of the cooperation, to prevent terrorist attacks in West Germany and Western Europe that could be traced back to East Germany. You want to engage in terrorist attacks against the Zionist enemy? That's a whole different matter. That's a whole different matter. And the Stasi files do have evidence about weapons. We're not yet at the point of an adequate number or of the full extent of Soviet bloc and East German armed resistance to the Arab states and PLO in this period. One thing that I also want a research note to bring to your attention is that millions of files of the Central Intelligence Agency have been declassified. And there is something called the CREST system, C-R-E-S-T. So if you go to the National Archives in Washington, you can sit at a computer and you type in a keyword, East Germany, terrorism, East German weapons delivery, East Germany, PLO, something like that. Hit the enter, and a whole bunch of files will turn up. And then you read them, and if you like it, you just hit print, and you print it out for free at the printer that's next to the computer. So it's really difficult research. Right? This is research for dummies. So if you're historians, Mark Kramer at Harvard tells me that the CREST, there's now efforts to put the CREST files online. I don't know if that's going to happen. If so, it'll be a huge resource. A lot of undergraduate, senior theses, graduate students, researchers, will have a remarkable amount of material. But fragments are better than nothing. On August 4th of 1980, the Ministry of State Security delivered the following items to the Palestine Liberation Organization. 2,000 Kalashnikov machine guns, 5,000 hand grenades, 750 plastic explosives of 200 grams, 370 explosives of 400 grams. On April 11th of 1980, it sent another 5,000 hand grenades. In 1982, before the war in Lebanon, it sent another 1,400 machine guns, the anti-tank rifles. These are the kind of things that a guerrilla movement needs, and they are a significant amount of lethal force, orders of magnitude larger than what the very famous West German terrorists had at their disposal. Let me see. Just a moment. Is there a technical person here who can help me out? Oh no.
Can you put icons in the very bottom?
I'm trying to make it big again. Thank you. The PLO did not have an airport. It didn't have a state. It didn't have the power and the resources that a state has. East German arms deliveries to the Arab states began in the mid-60s. And here is where the War of 1973, the Yom Kippur War, is interesting. It's particularly well documented in the East German Defense Ministry files. The relationship between East Germany and Hafez al-Assad, Syria, stood at the center of these efforts. This is a map which I found in Freiburg in the East German Defense Ministry file. This is a map. Again, it's not easy to see here, but the real map is about as big as this. Clearly, there was a labor of love. Somebody wanted this map was on the wall of offices in somebody's office in the East German Defense Ministry, And it is a map of the voyage of two ships, the Klosterberg and the Klosterfeld and the Freiburg, in October of 1973, from East Germany to Syria. And again, East Germany was small, 17 million people, didn't compare with the power of the Soviet Union. But as a historian of Germany, I am interested in the fact that any German government would be sending arms to people who were at war with Israel. Now, the cargo on these two ships was of 2,200 tons of military equipment. And it included 62 Soviet T-54 tanks with the necessary experts in ammunition, 300 anti-tank rifles with 24,000 shells, 75,000 grenades, 30,000 landmines. At the same time, a squadron of 12 MiG-21 jet fighters of the East German Air Force were flown by East German pilots to Syria, and the planes were then flown in combat against the Israeli Air Force by Syrian, but apparently also by Soviet pilots. This is what is called Operation Aleppo, and the German journalist, Stefan Meining, television journalist, has written about this, and I think done a television program about it. Now, these 2,200 tons was a fraction of what the Soviet Union was sending, and it was also a small fraction of the massive resupply operation ordered by President Nixon and then Henry Kissinger, called Operation Reforger, which led to 15, 18 flights a day of these enormous C-17 transports that resupplied the Israelis in this very crucial moment. I think the October of 1973 underscores, as few things have done in the post-war period, just how important the United States became for the survival of Israel. Had that not happened, who knows what would have taken place. Here at Fordham, I mean, I don't know if there's an Irish faction in the audience, but if there is, 2 cheers for you, because I want to say a few words about Daniel Moynihan. The speech that he gave on November 10th of 1975, in retrospect, strikes me as one of the most important speeches of the last half century, and one of the most important speeches in the history of the Cold War. Because it was Daniel Moynihan, and the Moynihan papers of the Library of Congress, which I've read, are interesting, fascinating. Letters from Norman Podhoretz and from Charles Frank at Yale, as Moynihan was composing the speech. Because Moynihan's speech, rejecting the Zionism as racism resolution, was a turning point, an intellectual, ideological turning point in the history of the Cold War. He was the first person, Kissinger didn't do it, he was the first leading Western statesman who challenged communist anti-Zionism and left-wing anti-Zionism. He said, after the General Assembly had passed the Zionism as racism resolution, he said, the United States does not acknowledge, will not abide by, and will never acquiesce in this infamous act. A great evil has been loosed upon the world. The abomination of anti-Semitism has been given the appearance of international sanction. He said, if, as the Soviet delegate had proposed, racism is a form of Nazism, and if, as this resolution, Zionism is a form of racism, then we have step by step taken ourselves to the point of proclaiming, the United Nations is solemnly proclaiming that Zionism is a form of Nazism, as Moynihan said. With innuendo and by implication, this was indeed what the Soviet Union and the East German propagandists had been claiming with growing ferocity since 1967, when they declared that every one of Israel's military operations was an unprovoked act of aggression, a blitzkrieg, a campaign of extermination that rested on racism and chauvinism towards Arabs. And these actions, according to the East Germans and the Warsaw Pact allies, and according to the PLO, were the essence of Zionism, and thus the reason that no compromise with such an evil was possible or desirable. It was why Arafat wrote, as he signed his letters to Honecker, that the revolution had to be conducted to victory, which would only mean the end of the Jewish state, presumably based as it was on racism and imperialism. In November of 1975, Daniel Moynihan became the first major political figure of the Western Alliance to say clearly and publicly that what we have here is a lie, he said, a political lie of a variety well known to the 20th century and scarcely exceeded in all that analog on truth and outrage. And the lie is that Zionism is a form of racism. The overwhelmingly clear truth is that it is not. Well, whoever is our new ambassador to the United Nations better do as well as Moynihan in the very difficult months to come, I hope. Now, I want to close with some questions that I think are pertinent to the purposes of this institute. The communists, as I said, hated Israel first and foremost because they were communists after the anti-cosmopolitan conversions. And they associated Israel with global imperialism. They didn't hate Israel because they hated Judaism. They didn't hate Israel because they had quotes from the Quran that called Jews apes and pigs. They hated Israel because they hated imperialism and capitalism. The East Germans hated Israel because it was effective diplomacy to gain recognition, and also because they were very orthodox communists. But I do think that it's accurate to say that East Germany was in a state of war with Israel. I haven't really come across a better term to describe it. It wasn't just antagonism, it wasn't just hostility, it wasn't misunderstanding. This was war. And if they had succeeded, and if the Soviet bloc had succeeded, they would have destroyed the state of Israel in one of the wars. Now, that raises the question of what is the connection between what I've been discussing this evening and what Charles has been preoccupied with, namely Islamist anti-Semitism. Nobody is going to argue if they read the Hamas charter, or they read what Osama said, or they look at the imams of the Muslim Brotherhood. No one's really going to argue that these people don't hate Jews as Jews, and that their hatred of Israel is because they hate the Jews, not because they have some economic and political theory about a global imperialism. So they're different. They're not the same thing. So what is the historic significance, then, of secular anti-Zionism? And I think I'll just throw this out, because this is a work in progress and I'm interested in discussion and not presenting my final conclusions. I think that secular anti-Zionism softened up global opinion. I think that was one of its most important functions. It softened up global opinion, and it made it respectable to despise Israel. To describe Israel in the most negative terms as racist and imperialist, and that it led to habituation for decades of leftist anti-Zionism. Perhaps this habituation explains in part why there has been a certain reluctance, I don't want to generalize, but a certain reluctance in liberal opinion, certainly in Europe and to some extent here, a certain reluctance to be quite as critical about the Islamists when they denounced Israel as one might expect. Perhaps the secular anti-Zionism that was dominant in the 60s, 70s, and 80s served a kind of protective cover and an advance guard, a kind of I'll avoid the sports metaphor, but a sort of a blocking force that broke through taboos that has made it easier for the more virulent Jew hatred of recent years to emerge and flourish. So that is what I have to say this evening. And yeah.
All right, so I have a few comments, questions, not in any good order, so I apologize. One element that that I'm surprised you haven't mentioned, and it could be that it's the footnoting I'm giving is not a good one, but I recall watching some documentary by ABC, I believe, about the relation between the Stasi and the Munich attacks. That, and, it might be, again, I'm sorry that but I think there is a charge that those who committed the Munich attack were actually transported into Germany through East Germany and through the.
That I've not seen. It's possible.
But I mean, I just like, you could. I'm sure you could.
One thing.
I don't know if it's true or not. I'm just.
Yeah, I will be looking into it. One thing that did happen after the Munich attack was that the West German government, as you can imagine, was embarrassed, humiliated, furious, and the terrorists in Munich made various phone calls during the action to people who were members of something called the General Union of Palestinian Students, GUPS, and the General Union of Palestinian Workers, GUPA. And their GUPS had members, they were the organized groups at about 28 different West German universities. Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who became the foreign minister, was the interior minister, and he cracked down that. GUPS was banned. And the West German investigative agencies were producing evidence that these people had been involved in preparing the attack and helping. And several hundred people were deported in the fall and winter of 1972. And some of them, when they were deported to the Middle East, then came back to East Germany. So that certainly is well documented. And I will look into it. But I think
we can even Google it. I think that I remember it was actually. But I have two other questions.
Yes.
This was in detail. First question, the first thing I would say is that I'm not, there's nothing about this that is sort of not known about Soviet bloc support for the Arab world. I'm not sure that if we're going to say that East Germany was at war with the State of Israel, we could say the United States was at war with the Arab world because the United States supplied Israel. So I think that the question here is not so much the fact that in the Cold War sides lined up one against the other, and it happened in Vietnam, it happened in the Middle East, it happened everywhere. But I think that the broader question that you raise is one that that strikes me as very important, and that is what is the meaning of this anti-Zionism? And I think that is this is a very interesting question that I commend you for asking, because at some level, we don't want to go into the McCarthy era condemnation of communism or socialism or something like this. And yet there is this element, there's this kernel of anti-Zionism that comes from there that is quite powerful.
Well, for historians of communism, the anti-cosmopolitan purges for a historian of communism are of enormous significance. Historians of the United States who focus on the McCarthy period, the Rosenberg case, dismiss it completely. Communism between 1935 and 1939, and 1941 and 1945, meant solidarity with the Jews. You were a communist. Jewish question meant you were opposed to anti-Semitism, you were opposed to the Nazis and the fascists. That's what being a communist meant. It meant trying to, it meant destroying the Wehrmacht. It meant arriving in Auschwitz, liberating Majdanek. The communists and the Jews, they're like this, right? The shattering of that bond, illusory though, however it may have been or may not have been, took place between 1949 and 1953, and nothing was ever the same after that. To be a communist after 1953 was to be an anti-Zionist. You could not be a communist and still support the state of Israel. You and there were there were not a lot of Jewish communists who took this position. There were some. There were some sort of non-Jewish Jews, Isaac Deutscher's phrase. And we spent a lot of time asking ourselves, was this anti-Semitism? Was it anti-Zionism? And the reason that the talk tonight was sort of mundane in some ways was because I'm a little bit at the moment less interested in what's going on, what people really feel about Jews. What I'm more interested in is what they're doing to help kill them. That's what I'm most interested in. And as a German historian, I find it to be a very important question in modern German history that there was a German government after Hitler that was sending machine guns to people who were firing them at Jews. Yeah. So in essence, that's my provincial sort of German historian's question. But David.
Right. So you're a German historian, but I kept thinking of the roads leading back to the Soviet Union, and I'm wondering if you yet have a sense in your research and what through the secondary literature we know of the Soviets' position, how the study of the East German relationship with Arafat against Israel might enlighten us differently from how the study of those Soviet relationships would.
Enlighten us about what?
Well, about sort of the nature of, for example, secular anti-Zionism, if you've called it, I think a good term, about the course of the Middle East conflict as it unfolds and the power alliances. That is, I mean, you at the beginning you talked about the question of autonomy, so in a way maybe I'm trying to get at that too. But does the East German route into the question of Israel's place vis-a-vis the Soviet bloc, Israel's, the Palestinians' relationship, tell us something substantially different, or from what a study of the Soviet archives might, which I know if you haven't looked at Soviet archives might be an unfair question, but.
Well, so the Soviets were more vicious and more willing to say blatantly anti-Semitic things than the East Germans were. The Soviet statements they are tougher and nastier. So the borderline between just old-fashioned anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the Soviet case is very thin, thinner than in East Germany. That's an excellent question. I mean, it's certainly what I'm doing will add new. There was I think East Germany lent legitimacy somehow to anti-Zionism. I think that if there was a German government that was opposed to Israel, somehow that made the fight against Israel sort of morally legitimate. If there were German anti-fascist communists who had fought against the Nazis, if they're opposing the Israelis, then maybe Israel really is God-forsaken. I hadn't thought that until you asked this question, but the East Germans may have had a kind of, maybe in the global left, maybe they lent that kind of legitimacy. Yeah, I think so. I'm going to think about that. Yeah.
I wanted to tie into your closing point about looking at the relationship between what you discussed and contemporary Islamic anti-Semitism. And I wanted to suggest that perhaps the more interesting connection would be by looking at the relationship between the contemporary left, which really is what used to be called the New Left, which is one, and the communist, the Warsaw Pact countries, including East Germany, and contemporary Islam. Because we've seen, I mean, what we've seen is clearly, they talk about the Red-Green Alliance, but whether you look at Hugo Chavez's warm welcoming among jihadis who have no particular reason to like a Latin American Catholic communist, or the folks running around the United States worried about the scourge of Islamophobia. I mean, you're seeing very strange behavior from the West that is hugely, from the Western left, that is hugely sympathetic to a movement that at its core would like to kill every member of the Western left. And I mean, I think these are the roots of that connection and that sympathy.
Well, I think I've thought about that, and I'm trying to reserve judgment. But maybe one thing that I was in the New Left, so of course I've thought about this. And when we were in the New Left, we thought we were very different than the communists. They were boring. They were conservative. They were dull. We were hip and open and interesting. And we were bringing a new world, and they were part of the old world. But in terms of the actual positions regarding events in the world, the banners on at the demos in West Germany regarding the Israeli-Arab conflict that were put there by, sponsored by various Marxist-Leninist groups or New Left groups, they weren't so different from the East Germans in terms of their position. They were supporting the PLO, they were supporting the Arab states, they were denouncing Israel. So maybe one thing we need to do is to think about how, in terms of the positions that people took, how much difference really was there. I mean, in a way, it's not so new. By 1969, the New Left was effectively pro-communist. It supported the victory against communism in the war. It was not anti-war. And so, I guess also what I'm saying is not so terrifically new. In Germany, for example, Rudi Dutschke is an interesting figure because he wasn't into the Middle East. That wasn't his bag. He was Vietnam, Latin America, global imperialism. It's interesting. Dutschke did not get into the hate Israel thing. I don't know quite why, but he had reservations about going down that path. It's not, it's not that there was a moderate Dutschke or something, but he didn't, he sensed there was something a little amiss. Robert Wistrich is kind of more blunt than I am about all this, and he basically describes Marxism and communism as an anti-Semitic tradition. Going back to Marx's essays on the Jewish question, and stresses the similarity of anti-capitalism and the association of the Jews with capitalism and that kind of thing. So if you write the history of Marxism and communism that way, then the Popular Front of 1935 to 39 and 1941-45 and the anti-fascism of the Second World War are these 8 years of exceptional communist-Jewish solidarity after 1917 or after the 1920s perhaps. And the norm is a certain skepticism and mistrust. But the language of the other thing is that, and here again, we're just at the beginning of examining the international left and its connection to Islamic organizations in the 50s and 60s and 70s. The Islamic organizations around the world were denouncing American imperialism. So there's a certain rhetorical overlap that just doesn't go back to the last 10 years. It goes back a long way.
No, of course.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what I'm suggesting is that for many years, for most of the 20th century, the Western New Left was a minor movement. It was part of the Western left, and it was never in control anywhere. Whereas the Eastern European communists certainly were a huge and major and important force. But in fact, the Western left survived the end of the Cold War intact. And so the balance is shifting. And rather than the communists trying to absorb the Western left, what happened was the new left absorbed the communists. And you've ended up with this hybrid movement that is, I mean, in American terms, it's today's Democratic Party represents the victory of the Henry Wallace wing over the Harry Truman wing.
Well, I don't want to get into that. I don't want to get into that. I mean, there's something to be said for it, and not to be said for it. But I will say this. I'll speak as a German historian. I'm not going to put on my political hat too much tonight. The German Studies Association had a 12 panels 3 years ago devoted to the state-of-the-art history of the German Democratic Republic. 40 papers, 30 or 40 papers, 12 panels. Not one dealt with East Germany's relation to the Middle East. So I said, well, what's going on? So the next year I organized a panel. And there was a young German historian, Lutz Mecke, who's finishing a doctoral dissertation on East Germany and the PLO. Another young woman who's doing a dissertation about East Germany and the relations with Yemen. Herman Wenker, who's a professor and directs the Institute for Contemporary History and branch in Berlin, is author of a huge book about East German foreign policy within the limits of the Soviet influence. We had a wonderful panel. So why was it that you could have 12 panels and 40 papers and there's no interest in what I was talking about tonight? Is this like an unimportant issue that East Germany was adopting this kind of policy towards Israel? Of course, there are many panels about coming to terms with the Nazi past and everything about Auschwitz. So, is this the triumph of the Western New Left? Well, most of these people really wouldn't any longer see themselves as leftists, but these issues didn't get discussed there. And so I said, now this is something that I'll do. It's not just the Western New Left. And here's where work on the United Nations is important. The denunciation of Israel at the United Nations beginning in the 60s was massive and continuous, and I think that had an effect. I think it has an effect if you're always being told that this state is, various forms of evil. Without any association with a lunatic interpretation of the Quran or the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. None of that. Maybe the significance of what I've talked about tonight is that these views of Zionism are part of modern political discourse. They're modern political discourse. They're not part of some retrograde vision of returning to the 7th century. And in that sense, they become more respected.
Yeah, so sorry I'm late. I was late.
You didn't miss the best part.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. So my question is, in your previous work, you make this very important connection between the Nazi regime and Nazi propaganda to its influence in the Middle East. So my background is social theory, cultural studies, post-colonial studies, and in this body of literature, we look at the impact of the social construction of identities, of notions of otherness, of belonging. We look at the impact of race and gendered relations on economic, social processes, even in language, symbols. So my question is, in this work, is it such a leap of faith to wonder why there's such a profound or important element of anti-Semitism in Eastern communist bloc country like East Germany or the Soviet Union, when anti-Semitism, there's this sort of imaginary break that we have in our minds in the social sciences that 1945 starts this new era. And yet the ideas, the symbols are, I would even use the word, ingrained in the civilization when it comes to the Jew. So the images may change, the incarnation of the other Jew changes, transforms even in a Christian society, in a capitalist society, in a communist society. But the break with the perception of the Jew as the other is consistent. The image changes, the discourse will change. So I'm wondering if is it so surprising that there's this strong...
I think that the willingness to describe Israel repeatedly as the aggressor, to describe the war in Lebanon as a war of extermination, to accuse the Israelis of genocide, I think the willingness to do that does have something to do with what you're describing. That is, this is what the Jews do. They kill people.
Children.
Yeah, right. And then they kill women and children especially. There's another element of this, and that is that the Israelis also have a voice. And throughout this period, the Israeli ambassadors at the United Nations and Israeli foreign ministers are saying, you're saying we're doing X, Y, and Z, but in fact we're not doing X, Y, and Z. We're doing A, B, and C. So the willingness to believe the worst entails a refusal to accept that what the Israelis are saying is true. That you never give them the benefit of the doubt. The Israelis are saying, no, it's not true. We didn't intentionally bomb this village. Or, no, it's not true that we're waging a war of extermination in Lebanon. That's not the case. So the willingness to write these kind of narratives about Israel is to say, we don't believe what the Jews are saying. And there is but I think this notion of ideological softening up and ideological preparation, because Erich Honecker would not want to sit down to dinner with Osama bin Laden. They wouldn't want to sit there sitting next to, Ayatollah Khomeini and hear him tell them about how the Quran. Well, first of all, he would just denounce them as infidels and hopelessly atheists and all that. But I think this notion of softening up and making it legitimate not to believe what the Jews are saying is an important aspect. Yes?
I have a question sort of about that notion of softening up, but particularly the type of material alliances that were motivating East Germany in terms of, if you take that sort of paradigm for the reasons why there are political relationships during the Cold War, when the Cold War ended, how did those relationships, that network of political interests, remain in terms of the salience of certain political
In the summer of 1989, and then even more so in the fall, Arafat and Kaddoumi wrote very, very upset letters to East Berlin. What is going on? They were not at all happy about the protests, about the weakness of the government, and then when the government fell, they were devastated. It was the collapse of communism in Europe that was one indispensable precondition for the Oslo process. There would have been no, quote, peace process if the PLO and the Arabs had not lost this huge base of support. And it wasn't just weapons. It was military training, it was hospitals, it was money, it was an alliance. So your major alliance partner collapses, you have fewer options. And I think that was one reason why Arafat decided to enter into the negotiations. I'm not sure if that addresses your question.
Well, I was wondering about the discourse of anti-Zionism in the United Nations, in the international community, how the end of the Cold War affected it, or whether those discourses remained without the material.
I haven't looked at the UN in the 1990s, my notion of my understanding of the UN is through the newspapers, and my sense is that nothing changed.
Well, it was repealed.
Yes, excuse me, you're right. Yes, that's right. The Zionism as racism resolution in 1992, I think, was repealed. That's true. Yes, and that was a direct result of the collapse of the Soviet bloc. But the ideas about Israel and its unacceptability remained an important part of quote the international community, whatever that